Across the stars, civilizations cried out for help, desperate, dying, unheard. The Zephyrian Collective, once proud and peaceful, watched its skies turn black as the Shadow Fleet descended. Worlds fell, hope died, until Earth answered. They weren't the strongest. They weren't the oldest. But they were something the galaxy had never seen, survivors of their own nightmares, forged in chaos, tempered in war. And when they came, they didn't bring mercy. They brought monsters in human form and a doctrine that would haunt the stars forever. This is the story of when Earth heard the call, and the galaxy met its last hope and its greatest fear. The silent screams, the crystal spires of Zephyria. Prime had stood for 10,000 years, their surfaces catching and refracting the light of 3 suns into cascades of rainbow brilliance that could be seen from orbit. The Zephyrian Collective had built their civilization on principles of harmony, trade, and peaceful coexistence. Their ships carried goods and knowledge across half the galaxy. Their diplomats had prevented 17 major wars through patient negotiation. And their cities were considered artistic marvels that inspired countless species. All of that was ending now, Ambassador. Lyra pressed her 4-fingered hands against the crystal window of the emergency command center, watching the sky burn. Her people's elegant ships, designed for commerce and exploration, fell like dying birds as dark shapes moved through the atmosphere like living shadows. The attackers had no ships in any conventional sense. They were the ships. Massive biomechanical nightmares that defied every principle of known technology. The first Shadow Fleet vessel had materialized without warning 3 days ago, appearing in the heart of Zephyrian space as if stepping through a doorway that existed only in nightmares. It was a thing of twisted metal and pulsing flesh, its hull rippling with patterns that hurt to look at directly. When the Zephyrian defense fleet had moved to intercept it, the creature had simply absorbed their energy weapons and grown larger. Status. Report, Lyra commanded, her melodic voice carrying the strain of sleepless days. Around the command center, her staff worked frantically at organic interfaces that grew from the walls like luminescent flowers. Coordinator Vel looked up from his station, his normally bright silver skin now dull with exhaustion. 7th Fleet. Reports total losses. The shadow vessels aren't just destroying our ships, Ambassador, they're converting them. Our own technology is being turned against us. Through the window, Lyra watched another impossibility unfold. A Zephyrian cruiser, one she recognized as the Harmony's gift, was being enveloped by tendrils of dark matter that seemed to phase in and out of visible reality. As the tendrils touched the ship's crystal hull, the beautiful structure began to change, its flowing lines becoming angular and predatory. What about the Galactic Defense Force? Lyra asked, though she already knew. The answer, the Altarian Republic is under similar attack. The Nexus Confederation has gone completely silent. The ethereal unions report their entire outer rim has been consumed. Vel's voice carried the weight of civilizations dying. Every major power is fighting for survival. No one can spare ships to help us. Lyra closed her eyes and felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her. The Zephyrian Collective had never been a military power. They had survived through diplomacy, trade relationships, and the protection of stronger allies. Now, with those allies falling one by one, her people faced extinction. There is one option, said technical advisor Zarn from across the room. His statement carried such reluctance that every head turned toward him. The humans have responded to our distress signals. A hush fell over the command center. Everyone knew about humanity, the newest members of the galactic community, admitted only 15 years ago after a contentious debate that had lasted decades. They came from what the galaxy euphemistically called a high-stress environment, though most species used less diplomatic terms when describing Earth. The humans? Lyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the failing environmental systems. Are you certain? Zarn activated a holographic display showing a transmission log. Admiral Sarah Chun of the Earth Defense Force, she says there, dispatching what they call a rapid response fleet to our location. Coordinator Vel's skin shifted through several color phases of distress. Ambassador, with respect, the humans are unstable. Their psychological profiles indicate excessive aggression, unpredictable emotional responses, and tactical doctrines that violate 7 different galactic warfare conventions. Lyra had read the reports about humanity during the admission debates. Earth was a world where survival required constant adaptation to threats that ranged from microscopic pathogens to planetary-scale disasters. The humans who had emerged from that crucible were unlike any species the galaxy had ever encountered: creative, resilient, and possessing what their own philosophers called a frightening capacity for necessary violence. "What choice do we have?" Lyra asked, watching another section of the city disappear beneath a wave of creeping shadow. "Our own defenses have failed. Our allies are gone. If the humans can help us survive, then we accept whatever they bring with them." The decision was made. Zarn transmitted their acceptance of human assistance, along with tactical data about the Shadow Fleet that might prove useful. What they received in return was a message that would be analyzed by xenopsychologists for decades afterward. Zephyrian Collective, this is Admiral Sarah Chun. We've reviewed your situation. The enemy you're facing exhibits characteristics similar to entities we've encountered before. Recommend you evacuate non-combatants to underground shelters immediately. Human reinforcements will arrive in 18 hours. Hold your positions. Until then, we're coming. The message was simple, direct, and carried an undertone that made Lyra's skin ripple with unconscious fear responses. There was something in the human admiral's voice, not arrogance, but a cold certainty that spoke of experience with things that civilized species preferred not to think about. 18 hours. The Zephyrian defenders had to survive 18 hours. Against an enemy that had already consumed half their fleet and was systematically dismantling their planetary defenses. Every minute felt like an eternity as the Shadow Fleet pressed its attack, the biomechanical horrors adapting to each new defensive strategy within moments of encountering it. The evacuation of civilians proceeded with the desperate efficiency that only comes from facing extinction. Zephyrian families that had lived in crystal towers for generations descended into the deep caves that honeycombed their world's crust. The caves were ancient, predating Zephyrian civilization, and had served as emergency shelters during the rare natural disasters that affected their stable world. As night fell across the primary continent, the Shadow Fleet began its final assault. The creatures moved like living nightmares, their forms shifting and flowing as if they existed partially outside normal spacetime. Energy weapons passed through them without effect, while their own attacks seemed to strike from impossible angles. Hitting targets that should have been protected by solid matter, Lyra remained in the command center, coordinating the last-ditch defense with what remained of her military forces. The Zephyrian way of war emphasized precision, coordination, and minimal casualties, principles that proved useless against an enemy that didn't follow the laws of physics. "Shadow vessels are breaching the inner orbital defenses," reported Vel, his voice barely above a whisper. "Estimated time until planetary assault begins, 47 minutes. Lyra looked at the chronometer display showing the time until human arrival, 17 hours and 12 minutes remaining. They wouldn't make it. That was when the first miracle occurred. At the edge of the star system, space itself seemed to tear, open like fabric being ripped apart. The phenomenon didn't follow any known principles of faster-than-light travel. It was more like watching reality develop a wound that bled starlight. Through the impossible aperture came ships that looked like they had been forged in the heart of a dying star. Human vessels were unlike anything the galaxy had produced. Where other species built ships with flowing lines and aesthetic beauty, humans created angular fortresses that looked designed to ram through obstacles rather than avoid them. Their hulls were scarred with what appeared to be battle damage but was actually deliberate texturing designed to deflect energy weapons and absorb impacts. The lead ship was massive, easily Dreadnought class, with weapon arrays that spoke of a species that had learned warfare through necessity rather than choice. Along its hull, in letters that somehow managed to look both primitive and menacing, was painted the name Unconquered, Admiral Sarah. Chion's voice filled the command center as her fleet took position between Zephyria Prime and the Shadow Fleet. Zephyrian forces, this is Admiral Chun. We're taking tactical control of the engagement. Recommend you withdraw to defensive positions and let us handle the heavy lifting. Lara activated the communication system with trembling hands. Admiral Chun, thank you for coming, but you're 17 hours early. How did you manage faster than light travel at that speed? There was a pause before Shun responded, and when she did, there was something like dark amusement in her voice. Ambassador, when humans really need to be somewhere, we find a way. As for how we got here so fast, let's just say we took a shortcut through some places that most species prefer to pretend don't exist. The human fleet arranged itself in a formation that made no tactical sense to Zephyrian observers. Instead of the coordinated defensive positions that Galactic Doctrine recommended, the human ships spread out in what appeared to be random patterns. Some vessels actually positioned themselves between Shadow Fleet units, as if inviting attack from multiple directions. Admiral, Lyra called out desperately, your formation is exposing your ships to crossfire. The Shadow Fleet will surround and destroy you. Ambassador, Chun replied calmly, we appreciate the concern, but humans have been surrounded before. It just means we can shoot in every direction. What followed would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. The Shadow Fleet, accustomed to easily overwhelming civilized opponents, attacked the human formation with confidence. Their biomechanical vessels phased through space, striking from impossible angles with weapons that existed partially outside. Normal reality. The humans responded with tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Instead of trying to avoid the Shadow Fleet's phase attacks, human ships deliberately moved into them, using specially designed hull plating. That seemed to interact with extra-dimensional energy in ways that caused catastrophic feedback in the attacking vessels. When Shadow Fleet creatures tried to absorb human energy weapons, they discovered that human weapons were designed to overload any system that tried to drain them. But it was the psychological aspect of human warfare that truly shocked the observers. Where other species fought with cold efficiency, humans fought with controlled fury that seemed to unnerve even the emotionless. Shadow Fleet, human communications were filled with battle cries, tactical jokes, and casual discussions of impossibly dangerous maneuvers. Reaper 6 to Admiral Chun, came one transmission. We've got 3 shadow crawlers trying to phase through our hull. Requesting permission to show them why humans invented the phrase, violation of physics. Permission granted, Reaper 6. Make it educational. The battle raged for 6 hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Shadow Fleet's extra-dimensional abilities allowed them to strike from unexpected directions, but human unpredictability seemed to anticipate attacks before they happened. Human weapons and armor were specifically designed to function in environments that shouldn't exist, while human tactics deliberately courted disaster in ways that somehow transformed certain defeat into unlikely victory. As dawn broke over Zephyria Prime, the impossible happened. The Shadow Fleet, which had never retreated from any engagement, began to withdraw. The biomechanical horrors pulled back toward the edge of the system, their forms flickering as if they were having difficulty maintaining coherence in normal space. Admiral Chen's voice filled the command center one final time. Zephyrian forces, immediate threat has been neutralized. However, long-term threat assessment indicates the Shadow Fleet will return with adapted countermeasures. Recommend evacuation of this system within 72 hours. Lyra stared at the tactical display showing Shadow Fleet withdrawal. Admiral, how did you know how to fight them? No one else has been able to even slow them down. There was a long pause before Chun answered, and when she did, her voice carried echoes of knowledge that civilized species weren't supposed to possess. Ambassador, humanity didn't evolve in a universe that played by the rules. We've been fighting things that shouldn't exist since we first looked up at the stars and realized we weren't alone. The Shadow Fleet is just another Tuesday for us. As the human fleet regrouped and began escort operations for Zephyrian evacuation ships, Lyra found herself wondering what kind of universe had produced a species that could casually engage in warfare against beings that existed outside reality itself. She would learn over the coming weeks that the answer to that question was more terrifying than the Shadow Fleet itself. Ghosts in the machine 3 days after the battle at Zephyr Prime. Ambassador Lyra found herself aboard the human flagship, unconquered, trying to understand how her people's saviors could exist in the same universe as civilized species. The ship's interior was a study in controlled chaos, corridors lined with armor plating that showed scorch marks from weapons testing, walls covered with tactical displays that tracked threats most species didn't know existed, and crew members who moved with the easy confidence of people who had learned to sleep while standing guard. Admiral Sarah Chun met her in a briefing room that doubled as an armory. The walls were lined with weapons that seemed designed for fighting enemies that conventional arms couldn't touch, guns that fired rounds of crystallized space-time, blades that cut through dimensions, and devices whose purpose Lyra couldn't even guess at. "Thank you for agreeing to this briefing, Ambassador," Chun said, gesturing to a seat that had been hastily modified for Zephian physiology. "I know our methods can be disturbing to species that haven't faced existential threats before." Lyra settled into the chair, her forearms unconsciously wrapping around herself in a defensive posture. "Admiral, I must ask, how did humanity develop such advanced warfare capabilities? Your species has been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. Shun activated a holographic display showing Earth's history, but not the sanitized version that appeared in galactic databases. This showed a world where survival was a daily struggle against forces that ranged from the microscopic to the planetary. Ambassador, humans didn't develop advanced warfare capabilities. We developed survival capabilities. The warfare part was just a side effect." The display showed images that made Lyra's photosynthetic skin pale. Humans fighting through ice ages, plagues, asteroid impacts, and something called the Titan Wars that seemed to involve combat against entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime. "The Titan Wars?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 40 years ago, Earth was invaded by beings that your science would classify as impossible," Chun explained matter-of-factly. "They existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously, could manipulate causality, and fed on the quantum uncertainty that underlies reality itself. By all logical standards, humanity should have been extinct within hours." The holographic display shifted to show battle scenes that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Human soldiers fighting creatures that looked like geometric nightmares, ships engaging enemies that existed in multiple time streams simultaneously, and weapons that seemed to function by convincing reality to behave differently. "How did you survive?" Lyra asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Commander Marcus Stone stepped forward from where he had been silently observing. He was typical of what Lyra was learning to recognize as elite human military personnel, scars that spoke of battles against enemies that shouldn't exist, eyes that had seen too much, and an aura of controlled danger that made her instincts scream warnings about predators. "We learn to cheat," Stone said simply. "When your enemies can rewrite the laws of physics, you learn to fight dirty. When they can exist in multiple dimensions, you learn to think in ways that don't make sense. When they can predict every logical strategy, you learn to be completely illogical." Dr. Elena Vasquez joined the briefing, her laboratory coat covering armor that looked like it had been designed to protect against weapons that fired concepts rather than projectiles. As humanity's leading expert on impossible physics, she had spent decades studying how to make technology work in environments where normal science failed. "The Titans taught us that the universe is much stranger and more dangerous than civilized species realize," Vasquez explained, activating technical displays that made Lyra's head hurt to look at. "They forced us to develop technology that functions by accepting that reality is more of a suggestion than a law." The displays showed human weapons that worked by convincing targets they were already destroyed, armor that protected by existing in multiple quantum states simultaneously, and ships that traveled faster than light by refusing to acknowledge the speed limit existed. But the cost, Stone added grimly, was that we had to become something that civilized species find disturbing. You can't fight monsters without learning to think like one. Lyra studied the faces around her, seeing the truth in their expressions. These humans had saved her people, but they had paid a price that went beyond physical scars. They had been changed by their experiences, shaped into something that could survive in a universe where survival often required abandoning everything that defined civilization. The Shadow Fleet, Chun continued, bringing up tactical data from the recent battle, represents a threat similar to what we faced during the Titan Wars. They exist partially outside normal spacetime. They adapt to conventional tactics faster than any logical opponent, and they seem to be directed by an intelligence that operates according to principles our science can't fully understand. The data showed patterns that made Lyra's analytical mind real. The Shadow Fleet's movements followed mathematical principles that required 11-dimensional thinking to comprehend. Their attacks came from directions that didn't exist in normal space, and their adaptation rate suggested they were learning from battles before they happened. How do you fight something like that? Lyra asked. By being something that can't be understood either, Stone replied. The Titans taught us that the best defense against impossible enemies is to become impossible yourself. As if summoned by their conversation, alerts began sounding throughout the ship. The tactical displays immediately shifted to show new contacts at the edge of the system, Shadow Fleet vessels, but different from the ones they had fought before. These were larger, more complex, and their energy signatures suggested they had adapted to counter human technology. Looks like they learned from our last encounter, Chun observed calmly. All hands to battle stations. Ambassador, I'm afraid you're about to see what humans do when the enemy gets creative. The human fleet moved with practiced efficiency, but their formation was unlike anything Lyra had ever witnessed. Instead of coordinated patterns, each ship seemed to be following its own tactical doctrine. Some vessels accelerated toward the enemy at suicidal speeds, others began moving in seemingly random directions, and a few simply stopped moving entirely. Admiral, Lyra said desperately, your fleet is scattering. The Shadow Fleet will be able to defeat you in detail. Ambassador, Chun replied with something that might have been amusement, scattered is exactly where we want to be. You can't be predictable if there's no pattern to predict. Captain Jake Iron Wolf Rodriguez led the first wave of human fighters, his squadron diving toward the Shadow Fleet in attack patterns that seemed designed more to confuse his own forces than damage the enemy. The fighters moved like living things, each pilot flying according to instincts rather than tactics, creating a formation that existed more as an emotional expression than a military maneuver. Iron Wolf to all units, Rodriguez's voice carried across the communications network. Remember, these things think in 11 dimensions, so we think in 0 dimensions. No plans, no patterns, just good old-fashioned human stubbornness. The Shadow Fleet attempted to adapt to the human attack, their biomechanical forms shifting to counter expected tactical movements. But the humans weren't following any tactics. They were improvising moment by moment, each pilot and ship commander making decisions based on intuition, experience, and what could only be described as weaponized creativity. Dr. Vasquez monitored the engagement from the unconquered science station, tracking the quantum-level interactions between human and Shadow Fleet technologies. Admiral, the enemy is having difficulty processing our tactical variants. Their adaptation algorithms are producing error cascades. What does that mean? Lyra asked. It means, Stone explained while coordinating defensive fire, that we're confusing them so badly. Their own intelligence is having system crashes. Turns out that even impossible aliens have trouble dealing with humans who refuse to make sense. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a clear advantage. The Shadow Fleet's superior technology and extra-dimensional abilities were countered by human unpredictability and weapons that seemed to function by sheer determination rather than scientific principles. Human ships that should have been destroyed kept fighting, human pilots flew through attacks that should have been impossible to survive, and human weapons continued to fire even after their power sources had been depleted. But as the engagement continued, Lyra began to notice something disturbing about the human approach to warfare. They weren't just fighting to win, they were enjoying it. Not in a sadistic way, but with the satisfaction of people who had found their purpose. These humans had been shaped by a universe that demanded constant adaptation to impossible threats, and they had learned to find meaning in that struggle. "Multiple shadow vessels approaching from impossible vectors," announced the tactical officer. "They're phasing through normal space faster than our targeting systems can track." "Switch to manual targeting," Chun ordered calmly. "Trust your instincts over your instruments?" What followed was a display of human intuition that defied scientific explanation. Human gunners began hitting targets they couldn't see, anticipating attacks from directions that didn't exist, and coordinating their fire through what could only be described as shared combat instinct. Commander Stone led a boarding action against a Shadow Fleet vessel that had materialized too close to the human formation. His Reaper squad consisted of soldiers who had been specifically trained to fight enemies that existed outside normal reality. Their equipment included weapons that fired bullets made of crystallized time, armor that protected by existing in multiple quantum states, and tactical gear that seemed to function by convincing the universe to make exceptions to its own rules. The boarding action was successful, but at a cost that civilized species would consider unacceptable. Half of Stone's squad was lost to attacks that couldn't be medically treated because they had been wounded in dimensions that human medicine couldn't access. Yet the survivors spoke of their casualties with the matter-of-fact acceptance of people who understood that some prices had to be paid. As the Shadow Fleet finally withdrew, leaving behind debris that phased in and out of visible reality, Lyra found herself staring at displays showing human casualties. The numbers were horrific by Zephyrian standards, yet the human crew seemed to consider the engagement a moderate success. "Admiral," Lyra said quietly, "how do your people maintain morale when the cost of victory is so high?" Chun looked at her with eyes that had seen too much war and too many friends lost to enemies. "That shouldn't exist. Ambassador, humans learned a long time ago that the alternative to fighting is extinction. When those are your choices, the decision becomes easier." Dr. Vasquez was already analyzing data from the engagement, her expression growing more concerned. As she reviewed the findings, "Admiral, the Shadow Fleet adaptation rate is increasing. They're learning to counter our countermeasures faster than we expected. How much time do we have?" Chun asked. "Based on current adaptation curves, they'll have developed effective counters to our tactics within 72 hours. After that," Vasquez shrugged in a gesture that somehow conveyed volumes about humanity's relationship with impossible odds. Lara felt a chill that went beyond physical temperature. "What happens then?" Stone answered while cleaning weapons that looked like they had been forged in a nightmare. "Then we learn new tricks. That's what humans do. We adapt faster than our enemies can adapt to us. It's not always pretty, and it's not always pleasant, but it's how we survive." As the human fleet regrouped and began preparing for the next engagement, Lyra realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Humanity hadn't just survived contact with beings that existed outside normal reality, they had learned to fight them effectively. And they had done so by becoming something that civilized species found deeply disturbing. The question that haunted her as she prepared her report for the Zephyrian leadership was simple. In asking humanity for help, had her people saved themselves from the Shadow Fleet only to invite something equally dangerous into their lives? When monsters fight monsters, the evacuation convoy from Zephyria Prime stretched across 3 light hours of space, a stream of refugee ships protected by the remaining Zephyrian Defense Fleet and Admiral Chun's human task force. Ambassador Lyra stood on the bridge of the refugee command ship Crystal Harmony, watching long-range sensors track their progress toward the emergency relocation zone near Altair Station. That was when the impossible happened again. "Contact!" shouted Sensor Operator Vel, his skin flashing through emergency color patterns. Shadow Fleet vessels materializing throughout the convoy formation. They're not coming from outside the system, they're manifesting inside our defensive perimeter. Lyra felt her 4 hearts skip beats as the tactical display populated with hostile contacts. Dozens of Shadow Fleet biomechanical horrors appeared among the civilian ships like predators materializing in a herd of prey. But these weren't the same creatures they had fought before. These new entities were larger, more complex, their forms incorporating elements that seemed to have been adapted from previous encounters with human technology. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the chaos on the emergency frequency. All civilian vessels, immediate scatter protocol. Human combat units engage at will. This is what we call a target-rich environment. What followed would be remembered as the Battle of the Scattered Stars, an engagement that redefined galactic understanding of what warfare could become when fought between species that had both transcended the normal limitations of physics. Captain Jake Ironwolf Rodriguez launched from the Unconquered in his modified fighter, leading a squadron of pilots who had volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission. Their fighters were small, fast, and equipped with weapons that civilian species would classify as war crimes if they understood how they worked. Ironwolf Squadron, this is your captain speaking, Rodriguez transmitted as his fighter screamed toward a Shadow Fleet bioship that was phasing through a cluster of refugee vessels. Today's mission is simple. Keep these nightmares away from the civilians. Remember, we're not trying to be heroes. We're trying to be the monsters that other monsters are afraid of. The human fighters dove into the Shadow Fleet formation with tactics that violated every principle of civilized aerial combat. Instead of coordinated attack patterns, each pilot flew according to personal combat philosophy developed through years of fighting enemies that couldn't be predicted or understood. Some pilots flew in spirals that followed mathematical sequences found in Earth's most dangerous weather patterns. Others moved in ways that seemed to mimic the hunting patterns of Earth's apex predators. Rodriguez himself had learned to fly by studying the movement patterns of a creature called a great white shark, a predator so efficient that it had remained unchanged for millions of years. His fighter moved through space like a living thing, anticipating enemy movements through instincts that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with understanding how predators thought. A Shadow Fleet bioship attempted to phase through his fighter, expecting to pass harmlessly through normal matter as they had with Zephyrian vessels. Instead, it encountered human technology that had been specifically designed to interact with extra-dimensional entities. Rodriguez's fighter didn't just survive the phasing attack, it trapped the bioship partially in normal space, creating a feedback loop that caused the creature to tear itself apart across multiple dimensions. Scratch one Shadow Squid, Rodriguez reported with the casual satisfaction of someone who had learned to find joy in impossible victories. Ironwolf Squadron, form up on me. We're going hunting. Aboard the Unconquered, Commander Stone coordinated the overall battle while monitoring psychological warfare. Broadcasts that Dr. Vasquez had developed specifically for fighting beings that existed outside normal reality. The broadcasts weren't just electronic signals, they were conceptual. Weapons that attacked the fundamental assumptions that allowed the Shadow Fleet to function. Psychological warfare systems active, reported Dr. Vasquez from her station. Broadcasting pattern 17, the one that suggests reality is more optional than the targets think it is. The effect was immediate and disturbing. Shadow Fleet bioships began flickering in and out of existence as their extra-dimensional nature became unstable. The psychological warfare wasn't just confusing them. It was making them doubt their own existence in ways that caused catastrophic system failures. What exactly are you broadcasting? Asked a Zephyrian military observer who had remained aboard the human flagship. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her console with the expression of someone who had spent many years studying things that civilized minds couldn't process. We're transmitting the philosophical concept that existence is a choice rather than a certainty. These entities maintain coherence by believing they're real, We're introducing doubt? The observer's skin shifted to colors associated with existential terror. You're fighting them with philosophy? We're fighting them with weaponized doubt. Stone corrected. Humans learned during the Titan Wars that some enemies can only be defeated by attacking the concepts that allow them to exist. The battle raged through the convoy formation, with human ships and fighters engaging Shadow Fleet. Entities in a three-dimensional chess game played according to rules that changed moment by moment. The Shadow Fleet had adapted to human tactics from their previous encounters, but humans had adapted too, developing new approaches that drew on Earth's vast catalog of survival strategies. Lieutenant Sarah Kim led a destroyer squadron in what she called pack hunting, a tactic inspired by Earthwolves that involved coordinating attacks through instinct and body language rather than electronic communications. Her ships moved in patterns that looked random, but were actually following predator-prey dynamics that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. Pack leader to all wolves, Kim transmitted. Target the big one in the center. Alpha. Strike on my mark. Remember, we hunt as a family. The destroyers converged on a massive Shadow Fleet command vessel with timing that seemed more like choreography than military tactics. Each ship attacked from a different angle, their weapons creating a web of destruction that the bioship couldn't adapt to because it couldn't predict movements based on emotional bonds rather than logical planning, but it was the ground combat that truly showcased humanity's unique approach to warfare. When Shadow Fleet boarding entities attempted to capture refugee ships, they encountered human Marines who had been specifically trained to fight enemies that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos led a response team aboard the refugee ship Hope's Dawn, where Shadow Fleet entities had materialized directly through the hull without creating breaches. The aliens they encountered were nightmares-given form creatures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with weapons that fired concepts rather than projectiles. Remember your training, Santos called out to her squad as they moved through corridors where geometry had begun to bend in ways that hurt to perceive. These things think they're scary. Show them what scary looks like when it evolves on a death world. The human Marines fought with equipment that seemed more like magical artifacts than military hardware. Their armor protected by existing in quantum superposition. Their weapons fired ammunition that had been convinced it was more destructive than physics allowed, and their tactics were based on principles learned from studying Earth's most dangerous predators. When a Shadow Fleet entity attempted to attack Santos by existing in her personal timeline simultaneously, she responded with a weapon that fired temporal bullets, projectiles that existed in multiple time streams and could damage targets that were spread across causality itself. Contact eliminated, Santos reported with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to treat impossibility as a routine part of the job. Area secured. Civilian casualties minimal. The turning point came when Captain Rodriguez made a discovery that would reshape the entire war. While pursuing a Shadow Fleet bioship through a debris field created by destroyed refugee vessels, his fighter sensors detected something that shouldn't have been possible. The bioship was showing signs of fear. Iron Wolf to Admiral Chun. Rodriguez transmitted urgently. I'm reading emotional resonance patterns from the target. These things aren't just intelligent, they're capable of experiencing terror. Dr. Vasquez immediately began analyzing the data from Rodriguez's encounter. What she found changed everything they thought they knew about the Shadow Fleet. Admiral, the psychological warfare is working better than we expected. These entities don't just exist outside normal reality, they exist outside normal emotional frameworks, too. They've never encountered fear before, and they don't know how to process it. Admiral Chun saw the implications immediately. All units, shift to terror tactics, make them afraid of us. What followed was a display of human psychological warfare that would be studied and debated for centuries. Human ships began broadcasting sounds that had been recorded in Earth's deepest caves, the sounds that had terrified humanity's ancestors for millions of years. Human fighters flew in formations that mimicked the approach patterns of Earth's most feared predators. Human weapons were modified to create not just physical damage, but sensory experiences that triggered primal fear responses. The effect on the Shadow Fleet was catastrophic. Entities that had conquered dozens of civilizations without ever experiencing doubt suddenly found themselves confronted with an enemy that understood fear as both a weapon and a survival tool. Bioships that had phased through reality with confidence began manifesting incorrectly, their forms becoming unstable as their pilots experienced emotions they had no framework for understanding. Commander Stone coordinated the final phase of the battle from the Unconquered's command center, watching as the Shadow Fleet began to retreat not because they were defeated, but because they were afraid. "Target the command vessels," he ordered. "Don't let them adapt to fear. Keep them terrified." The human fleet pressed their psychological advantage with ruthless efficiency. Ships that had been designed to fight enemies that violated the laws of physics now proved equally effective against enemies that had never learned to cope with their own emotions. Shadow Fleet bioships flickered out of existence not because they were destroyed, but because their crews had become too afraid to maintain coherence. As the last Shadow Fleet entities retreated into whatever dimensional space they called home, a convoy formation found itself surrounded by the strange aftermath of a battle fought with concepts and emotions as much as weapons and tactics. Refugee ships that had been seconds away from destruction now floated safely in space, protected by humans who had turned fear itself into a weapon. Ambassador Lyra stood on the bridge of the Crystal Harmony, watching the tactical displays clear of hostile contacts. Around her, Zephyrian crew members stared at the humans with expressions that mixed gratitude with something approaching terror. "Admiral Chun," Lyra transmitted to the human flagship, "how did you know that fear would be effective against them?" Chun's reply carried the weight of experience that civilized species weren't supposed to possess. "Ambassador, humans have been afraid longer than we've been anything else. We understand fear like other species understand mathematics. These Shadow Fleet entities may be impossible, but they're not human. They never learned that fear isn't something that destroys you, it's something that makes you stronger." Dr. Vasquez was already analyzing the psychological impact data from the engagement, her expression growing more thoughtful as she reviewed the findings. "Admiral, I'm detecting residual emotional resonance in local spacetime. The Shadow Fleet's experience of fear has left echoes dem phantom field." "What kind of echoes?" Stone asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "The kind that will spread through their dimensional network," Vasquez replied grimly. "We didn't just defeat this attack force. We introduced the concept of fear to their entire collective consciousness. They're going to remember this encounter, and they're going to remember us." Captain Rodriguez docked his fighter in the Unconquered's bay, his squadron having lost 3 pilots to attacks that couldn't be medically treated because they involved damage to aspects of existence that human medicine didn't recognize. Yet, as he climbed out of his cockpit, his expression was one of grim satisfaction. "Status report, Captain," Chun asked as Rodriguez joined the command staff. "Mission accomplished, Admiral," Rodriguez replied. "We kept the civilians safe, and we taught some nightmares what it feels like to be afraid. The Shadow Fleet will think twice before attacking refugee convoys again." Sergeant Santos led her Marines back aboard the Unconquered after completing sweep operations on the damaged refugee ships. Her squad had successfully eliminated all Shadow Fleet boarding entities, but the cost had been high. 2 Marines had been lost to weapons that attacked their existence rather than their bodies, and several others were suffering from what military medical personnel called conceptual wounds, injuries to aspects of reality that normal medicine couldn't address. Yet despite the losses, Santos and her team moved with the quiet confidence of people who had successfully protected innocent lives against impossible odds. They had learned, through hard experience, that sometimes protecting others required accepting costs that civilized species would consider unacceptable. As the convoy resumed its journey toward safety, Ambassador Lyra found herself wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The humans had saved her people again, but they had done so by becoming something that existed outside the boundaries of what galactic civilization considered acceptable. They fought with weapons that attacked concepts rather than matter, they used fear as a tool of war, and they accepted casualties that other species would consider catastrophic. "Admiral," Lyra transmitted to Chun during the post-battle briefing, "I must ask, what has humanity become? Your people fight enemies that shouldn't exist using methods that violate everything we understand about civilized behavior." Chun was quiet for a long moment before responding, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that had shaped not just battles, but the fundamental nature of her species. "Ambassador, humanity became what it needed to become to survive in a universe that's stranger and more dangerous than civilized species realize. We learned that sometimes, to protect what you love, you have to be willing to become the monster in someone else's nightmares." The truth of that statement hung in the space between them as the refugee convoy continued its journey. Behind them, the space where the battle had been fought still echoed with residual terror, fear given form and substance, a warning to anything that might threaten innocent lives that humanity was watching, and humanity remembered how to be afraid and how to make others afraid in return. The Shadow Fleet had learned something new about the universe they thought they controlled. There were monsters in the dark between stars, but some of those monsters protected rather than consumed. And those monsters had learned their trade-on. A world where survival meant understanding that sometimes the only thing scarier than becoming a predator was becoming prey. As the stars wheeled past the convoy's course toward safety, Ambassador Lyra realized that her people had been saved by beings who understood something that civilized species had forgotten, that in a universe full of nightmares, sometimes you needed nightmares of your own to stand guard in the dark.